Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Welcome to Policy and Rights, the show about government policy and human rights.
The 1145th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation concerning Iraq. The agenda is adopted. I should like to take this opportunity to pay tribute on behalf of the Council to His Excellency Mr. Nicolas de Rivière, Permanent Representative of France, for his service as President of the Council for the month of September. I'm sure I speak for all members of the Council in expressing deep appreciation to Ambassador Rivière and his team for the great diplomatic skill with which they conducted the Council's business last month. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Iraq to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Janine Hennis-Plechaert, Special Representative of the Secretary-General and Head of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to documents S/2022/696, the 35th report of the Secretary-General on the implementation of paragraph 4 of Security Council Resolution 2107, and S/2022/714, the report of the Secretary-General on the implementation of Resolution 2631. I now give the floor to Ms. Janine Hennis-Plechaert. You have the floor.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Distinguished members of the Security Council. Calls for Iraq's leaders to overcome their differences and form a government have abounded since elections were held a year ago. Over the past 12 months, we underlined time and again the importance of maintaining calm, of maintaining dialogue, constitutional compliance, respect for democratic principles, the unimpeded working of state institutions, and a functioning government to effectively address the legitimate demands for better public services, jobs, security, an end to corruption, and justice and accountability, to name a few. But regretfully, discord and power play prevailed over a sense of common duty. And as a direct result of protracted political inaction, Iraq experienced some very critical and dangerous hours. With protests and counter-protests being staged, tensions were on the rise for months. Supporters of political parties, many of whom carry weapons, got increasingly worked up. And one did not need a crystal ball to see where this could lead. Meanwhile, the ordinary Iraqi citizen was being held hostage to an unpredictable and untenable situation. A dire situation that culminated on Monday, August 29, when the country stood on the brink of total chaos. Political tensions degenerated in armed clashes, in the heart of the capital and elsewhere. The sad result, dozens of people killed and hundreds wounded. Now, these tragic developments are indisputably the result of the inability of Iraq's political class to cast the die. In other words, actors across the spectrum failed to place the national interest first. They left the country in a prolonged impasse, further fueling already simmering anger. And while one would expect that recent events would have served as a wake-up call, the harsh reality is that to date, intra-Shia strife has not abated, nor have Kurdish parties come closer to agreeing on a presidential candidate. So where do we stand now? The situation remains highly volatile. After more than 2 months of paralysis, Parliament resumed its sessions last Wednesday, September 28, amid very tight security measures. These measures, however, did not prevent further incidents, including a number of IDF impacts, as well as clashes between protesters and security forces. Now, to be clear, there is zero justification for violence. Yet, in this instance again, many were injured. 11 civilians and more than 120 members of the Iraqi security forces, all sons of the country. And we have not seen the end of it yet. Last night, after 3 days of rocket attacks, Basra witnessed intense fighting, while smaller incidents were reported in other southern governorates. Mr. President, on the 1st of October, last Saturday, we remembered the victims of the Tishreen demonstrations. 3 years ago, as you recall, Iraqis took to the streets to protest a lack of political, economic, and social prospects. It was a mobilization of an unprecedented scale, and it turned into a tragedy. Several hundreds of Iraqis died, and many more were severely injured, abducted, threatened, or intimidated. Now, as a result of this protest, the previous government stepped down, and early elections were organized a year ago. In other words, and I said it often, last year's elections were extremely hard-earned. And with this in mind, the absence of a functioning government 12 months later is hard to justify. Last Saturday, new protests were expected. The hope was that they would be held peacefully. But in the early morning hours, we woke up to another call of our sense and warn alarm system. The day was not off to a promising start. Throughout the day, however, protester numbers remained relatively low. Not because Iraqis are now suddenly content, but because they do not wish to be instrumentalized in the ongoing power struggle, as made abundantly clear by many of those who took to the streets in 2019. It has to be said, last Saturday, the Iraqi security forces demonstrated great restraint in their response, adhering strictly to given orders. Regretfully, some disruptive elements were present on the streets, and I can only reiterate the importance of keeping any protests away from violence. The fact is, the smallest spark can suffice to trigger a major disaster. Mr. President, we brought our full support to the national dialogue under the auspices of Iraq's Prime Minister, a forum that so far convened twice. For this initiative to bear fruit, however, it is crucial that all parties take their seat. I repeat, all parties. Now, as an aside, it is worth noting that none of the parties were represented by women. That said, it is also incumbent on all to act responsibly in times of heightened tensions. This means refraining from making provocative statements and feeding into counterproductive, not to say harmful discourses. And while I'm usually disinclined to air our initiatives publicly, I would like to emphasize our intense engagements during the past months and weeks. from participating in dialogue and holding countless bilateral meetings to drafting roadmaps and conducting shuttle diplomacy in various forms. Believe me, we tried, non-stop. That said, we do not have a magic wand. Ultimately, it all comes down to political will. Equally important is the understanding that at the end of the day, one can only be influential if you accept the influence of others, if only there was a willingness to compromise. One thing is clear, the persistent and overt lack of trust perpetuates a zero-sum game, a game in which commitment to concrete solutions is being avoided. Having said this, Mr. President, there are solutions. Of course, every situation has its own history and idiosyncrasies. But let me be clear. Since the elections were held a year ago, all sides, and I mean all sides, they made strategic mistakes and miscalculations. More importantly still, they missed many valuable opportunities to resolve their differences. And with risks of further strife and bloodshed still very tangible, dwelling on who did what when is no longer an option. Hence, it is time for Iraq's leaders, all of them, to engage in dialogue, collectively define core Iraqi needs, and pull the country back from the ledge. In other words, all leaders should assume responsibility and return the spotlight where it must be, on the people of Iraq. Now make no mistake, public disillusion is running sky high. Too many Iraqis have lost faith in the ability of Iraq's political class to act in the interest of the country and its people. And a continued failure to address this loss of faith will only exacerbate Iraq's problems. Focus is equally important. We have seen the announcement of a plethora of initiatives since the elections in October last year, but too many tracks and too many cooks distract, confuse, and blur the picture. As I said, there are solutions, but for solutions to see daylight, genuine and timely dialogue is essential, including a willingness to compromise. And yes, it goes without saying, delivering a functioning government is merely the first step to overcoming the current crisis in a sustainable way. A wide range of critical issues must be addressed. Chief amongst them is the adoption of a federal budget, absent which state spending could come to a halt by the end of the year. And work towards transformative change has to kick off. Let us face it, since 2003, too many opportunities to conduct meaningful and much-needed reform have been wasted. Nearly 20 years on, Iraq's leaders must acknowledge that systemic change is vital for the country's future. Now, attempts to push through incremental reform, including in the fight against corruption, have failed so far, having been actively undermined or obstructed. I said it many times, also in your chamber. Corruption is a core feature of Iraq's current political economy, built into everyday transactions. This is not just me saying it, it is widely recognized. A related feature is Iraq's reliance on patronage and clientelism. This has resulted in a ballooning, inefficient public sector that functions more as an instrument of political favor than as a servant of the people. And while Iraq is by no means a poor country, private and partisan interests conspire to divert resources away from critical investment in national development. What I'm saying is, Iraq's political and governance system ignores the needs of the Iraqi people, or even worse, actively works against them. Now, pervasive corruption is a major root cause of Iraqi dysfunctionality. And frankly, no leader can claim to be shielded from it. Keeping the system as is will backfire sooner rather than later. That said, it is important to frame it as precisely that, a system, rather than a collection of individuals or a series of events. Mr. President, as calls for early national elections have become more pronounced, let me elaborate further on this topic. Besides the obvious benefits for political parties to clarify a number of matters in advance, we emphasize the importance of following established legal procedures and mechanisms. We also made clear that at this point in time, we would not be able to confirm UNAMI's ability to assist in new elections, as this would depend on a formal request of the Iraqi government addressed to your council and, of course, subsequent deliberations. Other questions are also worth raising. For instance, what are the guarantees that new national elections will not be held in vain once again? How will Iraqi citizens be persuaded that it's worth casting their vote? And what reassurances would the international community need for them to support new elections? Mr. President, on the topic of elections, we have also actively engaged Kurdistan region authorities and political parties on several outstanding issues related to the 6th Kurdistan region parliamentary elections. Now, these elections were initially scheduled for the 1st of October, that is, 3 days ago. To date, however, Kurdistan region political parties are yet to find common ground, with again the yellow and green divide as the single most disruptive factor impeding progress. In no uncertain terms, we made clear that here also we do not have a magic wand. Here also it comes down to political will. Here also party leaders should understand that one can only be truly influential if they accept the influence of others. Hence, a willingness to compromise is essential. More generally, monopolizing power breeds instability. That goes for both Iraq as a whole and for the Kurdistan region. Now let me stress the following. The political fallout of not conducting timely Kurdistan region parliamentary elections, of not properly managing public expectations, of neglecting basic democratic principles will bear a high cost. And if that were to happen, it would not be for lack of warning. Hence, we are impatiently waiting for parties to fulfill their many promises and to act in the service of the peoples of the Kurdistan region. Mr. President, addressing the Council in May, I raised the alarm at Turkish and Iranian shelling in the north, having become the new normal for Iraq. And with last week's Iranian attacks, I can now only repeat myself. These reckless acts, which have devastating consequences, killing and injuring people, must cease. No neighbor should treat Iraq as its backyard. No neighbor should be allowed to routinely and with impunity violate Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Yet it is happening time and again. Mr. President, on the issue of missing Kuwaiti and third country nationals and missing Kuwaiti property, including the national archives, we are pleased to see that Iraq's efforts to reach new witnesses continue unhindered. These witnesses are of great importance to help locate new potential burial sites. Equally important is the contribution of tripartite member states through their provision of satellite imagery analysis. The handover by Iraq on July 4 of additional missing Kuwaiti property, including a historical sword, 2 historical copies of the Holy Quran, and items belonging to the Kuwaiti Ministry of Information, marks another positive step. Now, it is hoped that with persistence, determination, and commitment from all, more results will soon emerge. Mr. President, to conclude my remarks, let me again emphasize the importance of embarking on a path towards political stability. And let me say it once more, there are solutions. And it is in the power of any Iraqi leader to drag the country into a protracted and deadly conflict, as it is in their power to place the national interest first and lift the country out of this crisis. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je le remercie.
I thank Ms. Enis Pleschert for her briefing. I now give the floor to those members of the Security Council who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Merci bien, Monsieur le Président. And thank you, Special Representative Hannes Plaschert, for your frank and useful briefing and for your leadership of UNAMI, which continues to play such an important and respected role in Iraq. I must start by strongly condemning the IRGC missile and drone attacks in the Iraqi Kurdistan region on September 28th. Iran fired at least 48 ballistic missiles, a major escalation of Iranian violations of Iraqi sovereignty. Iran's flagrant violation of Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity must stop. Such a brazen attack on a neighbor's territory, especially one that results in the deaths of innocent civilians, is morally reprehensible. We remain concerned about the prospects for renewed violence and welcome the efforts of Iraqi security forces personnel to prevent escalation and protect the right to peaceful protest. The only legitimate way to achieve reform and form a government responsive to the needs of the Iraqi people is through constructive and inclusive dialogue, not violence. Today's briefing comes, as we have heard, nearly 1 year after Iraq held parliamentary elections. Despite the fact that the elections were credible, peaceful, and well managed, the elected parliamentarians and their party leaders have failed to form a government that serves the people of Iraq. This extended period of political maneuvering has delayed the critical work of the government to the detriment of Iraq and its people, and increased tensions that have in some cases, as we've heard, devolved into violence. We call on Iraq's elected leaders to shoulder their responsibilities, make compromises, avoid violence, and form an inclusive government capable of delivering transparent, effective governance. Complicated challenges face the next government, including passing a budget, developing oil and gas legislation that is acceptable to the government of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government, improving the provision of electricity, combating climate change, promoting private sector development and job growth, and increasing women's participation in the workforce. This month also marks 3 years since the Tishreen protests and the brutal repression of protesters by Iran-affiliated militias intent on silencing the legitimate demands of the Iraqi people. We call on the Iraqi government to hold accountable those individuals and groups responsible for the abuse of protesters, which left hundreds dead and thousands wounded. We welcome news of progress on the repatriation of Iraqis from the Al-Hol camp and encourage continued cooperation between the government, UNAMI, and other humanitarian actors to provide Iraqi families and orphans essential legal documents and to rehabilitate and reintegrate them into their communities safely, voluntarily, and with dignity, in accordance with their wishes. We call on the government of Iraq to continue its efforts to create conditions that will allow displaced persons to return to their homes and facilitate durable solutions. It is also important that the government of Iraq and the Kurdistan regional government implement the Sinjar Agreement and address urgent reconstruction and livelihood needs in the Yazidi homeland, where some of Iraq's most vulnerable communities languish without adequate security, infrastructure, education, psychosocial support, and livelihoods. We listened with interest to Prime Minister Kadmi's address to the General Assembly. His description of the environmental degradation facing Iraq was particularly concerning. We support UNAMI's efforts to assist Iraq as it works to mitigate this environmental crisis and adapt to climate change, including through sustainable development, water management, and the use of renewable energies. We encourage Iraq's neighbors and partners to assist as appropriate. In conclusion, Mr. President, my delegation congratulates Iraq on the occasion of its National Day on October 3rd, commending the resilience of the Iraqi people as they overcome existential challenges and look toward a more peaceful and prosperous future. We call on all states to support Iraq and respect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant des...
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Representative of the Secretary General to Iraq, Ms. Janine Hennis-Plasschaert, for the briefing. We appreciate UNAMI's work in Iraq and extend full support to SRSG's efforts. I also welcome the participation of Permanent Representative of Iraq in today's briefing. Mr. President, nearly a year after the holding of peaceful, free and fair parliamentary elections, the people of Iraq still do not have an elected government. The continuing political impasse impacts the people of Iraq directly, who have already endured immense challenges in the last 2 decades, from terrorism to economic hardships. India urges all political parties to rise above their differences and assume greater responsibility to overcome the current stalemate. A peaceful dialogue on a constructive way forward is the need of the hour. In this regard, we welcome the convening of the national dialogue among Iraq's political leaders and parties. Constructive engagement by all parties in the dialogue is a critical first step to avoid further political deadlock and violence. The ongoing political instability also affects the security situation in Iraq, which continues to be fragile and volatile. We are deeply concerned about the continued terrorist attacks of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. The terrorist forces must not be permitted to exploit the current political vacuum in the country. The continued possession of arms and weapons in large quantities outside state control is a matter of grave concern. It poses a serious challenge to stability in Iraq. The deadly clashes of August 29th and 30th serve as a timely reminder and highlight the urgency of addressing this issue within Iraq's constitutional framework. Mr. President, the repeated violations of Iraq's sovereignty under the pretext of counter-terrorism operations must end. We condemn all such acts and call upon Iraq's neighbors to work with the Iraqi authorities to address all security challenges that they face. Despite its internal challenges, Iraq continues to be a positive contributor to regional stability and friendly relations. We welcome Iraq's efforts and constructive role in promoting regional talks aimed at strengthening security and stability in the region. We also welcome the cooperation between the governments of Iraq and Kuwait to achieve an amicable solution to the issue of missing persons and the return of Kuwaiti properties. It is imperative to maintain the momentum and move towards an early and mutually satisfactory conclusion to this important humanitarian file. Mr. President, let me conclude by reiterating the importance of the sense of urgency required for Iraq's political leaders to overcome divisions, set aside partisanship, and attempt to put the interest of the people of Iraq at the forefront. An end to the political deadlock is urgently required to meet people's aspirations and hopes and secure their safe and prosperous future. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me start by commending the tireless efforts of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Iraq and of the Special Representative in difficult circumstances. We'd like to make 4 points today. First, the UK offers our deepest condolences for the deaths and casualties caused by the violence in the international zone in Baghdad on the 29th and 30th of August. As the Special Representative said, the country stood on the brink of chaos. We cannot allow violence to destabilize the political process. We urge Iraq's leaders to work together urgently in the coming weeks to find a peaceful, inclusive solution to the political crisis. The political impasse has gone on too long. This will enable Iraq to address and tackle the considerable challenges faced by its people, from ensuring the country's long-term security to tackling climate change, delivering urgent economic reform, and reconstructing the areas of the country liberated from the control of Daesh. Second, the UK condemns in the strongest terms Iran's indiscriminate missile attack on Kurdish towns on the 28th of September, which led to the loss of innocent lives and damaged civilian infrastructure. These attacks are a violation of Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity and are wholly unacceptable. They demonstrate a repeated pattern of destabilizing activity in the region by Iran. We stand with the Kurdistan Regional Government in condemning these attacks and continue to support the security of Iraq, including the Kurdistan region. Third, we need to manage carefully the humanitarian risks. We welcome the efforts by the FAO and the WFP to support food production and sustainable resource management. We urge regional neighbours to engage with the government of Iraq on water shortages. The UK is also working with UNDP to support the government of Iraq in dealing with the worst effects of climate change, including providing support on the governance of water resources. Finally, we welcome the Special Representative's update on missing Kuwaiti and third country nationals and missing Kuwaiti property. We note the progress made on the identification of burial sites, including in Najaf, and we urge continued progress on this file. Mr. President, the fundamental point is this. As the Special Representative has said, Iraq's political leaders must step up their efforts to resolve the current impasse and begin delivering for the Iraqi people. And as a Council, we must be united in encouraging progress on this. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, and my thanks also to the Special Representative for her briefing this morning. Ireland sincerely appreciates your efforts and that of your team in UNAMI in what has been a really, really challenging period, and thank you, Janine. We deeply regret that the situation in Iraq has deteriorated considerably since we last met in May. It is almost 1 year to the day, as others have said, since well-managed and peaceful elections took place across the country. However, government formation remains painfully elusive. This comes at great cost for the Iraqi people, for whom critical reforms are long overdue. We unequivocally condemn the violent clashes at the end of August in Baghdad, which led to at least 46 deaths. We strongly urge all actors to refrain from resorting to violence to settle political disputes and to make every effort to de-escalate tensions. The right to peaceful protest is, of course, a fundamental pillar of any democracy, but respect for state institutions and for the Constitution must also be upheld. Dialogue can be the only way to overcome the current deadlock. We welcome the efforts by Prime Minister Al-Kadhimi to this end, including through the convening of a national dialogue. We encourage all actors to engage in good faith to reach agreement on a fully empowered government. Mr. President, more broadly, the security situation at present in Iraq is precarious. Ireland has condemned the 20 July deadly artillery attack in Dohuk, which tragically killed 9 civilians and injured more. Shelling last week in the Kurdistan region, claimed by Iran, which has also reportedly resulted in civilian casualties, is deeply concerning. Such attacks must cease immediately. We urge all actors to respect Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity at all times. We recall how Iraq has shown remarkable commitment to enhancing regional dialogue and fostering good neighbourly relations over the past years. Iraq's regional and international partners should match this. Its stability is critical to that of the region. Mr. President, Iraqi women performed remarkably in last year's elections, winning a record number of seats. We commend their activism and achievements in spite of significant obstacles. We also acknowledge the impactful work of UNAMI in engaging with women voters and candidates in the run-up to elections. However, as has been noted by the SRSG this morning, this exemplary performance last October has regrettably not translated into their full, equal and meaningful participation in the government formation process, with women largely excluded from the talks. Later this month, the Security Council Informal Experts Group on Women, Peace and Security will consider the situation in Iraq. This provides an opportunity to identify ways to address the barriers to their participation in political and public life, and we look forward to this discussion. Mr. President, we were disappointed by the findings of the recent OHCHR UNAMI report on accountability and unidentified armed elements in Iraq. While progress on compensation for victims of human rights abuses and violations is a welcome step, true accountability lies in ending impunity. We urge the Iraqi authorities, albeit in a complex operating environment, to ensure credible investigations for all alleged violations and human rights abuses perpetrated against protesters, activists, journalists and critics. Without this, trust between the state and the Iraqi people will remain elusive. Finally, Mr. President, we welcome the commitment of both sides to further progress on the Iraq-Kuwait file related to missing persons and property. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Ireland for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I will join you in thanking France for the work that they did during the month of September, and wish you, President, all the best for the month of October. You can rely on the support of Albania during this month. Going back to the issue under discussion, I would like to thank SRSG Plashert for the briefing and welcome the representative of Iraq to this meeting. Mr. President, we condemn in the strongest terms the deadly attack in Iraq. Albania expresses its deepest sympathy and condolences to the victims' families and wishes speedy and full recovery to those injured. Furthermore, we call on Iran to respect Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity and to refrain from intimidation, threats, and further escalation of violence. We reaffirm our strong support for Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity and condemn all attempts to undermine Iraq's stability and political independence. Furthermore, we are also worried about the security situation regarding the threat posed by Daesh. I reiterate Albania's principled support for accountability for all violations of international law, for delivering justice, and for taking a firm stance against impunity. Mr. President, Iraq has gone through enormous challenges in the recent years. However, the deadlock in the government formation process following the October 2021 parliamentary elections is a growing threat to the stability of the country and its role in the region. We urge all the parties involved to rise above their differences and commit to inclusive dialogue. There is an urgent need for a new Iraqi government to tackle many challenges ahead, as mentioned by SRSG. Women and girls are affected by many of these challenges. An inclusive and a united government with meaningful participation of women will better respond to the hopes and aspirations of the Iraqi people. In the current acute and dire humanitarian situation that Iraq is facing, we commend that the Iraqi authorities have repatriated over 25,000 Iraqis while respecting the principle of accountability and reintegration. In addition, concerning the repatriation and return of all Kuwaiti and third country nationals of their remains, we welcome the intensified field mission, which will increase the possibility of identifying new burial sites in Iraq, and we commend the recent handover of Kuwaiti property. This is also an essential step forward in Iraq's efforts to strengthen its social contract with its citizens and neighbors. We also welcome the adoption of the law for emergency support for food and security and development, and hope that its implementation will lessen the suffering of the Iraqi people. Mr. President, considering that Iraq is the fifth most vulnerable country in the world to the effects of climate change, we commend the work UNAMI does on the impact of climate change in Iraq, and we took note of the concerns that Iraqi Prime Minister expressed during the GA session on this issue. In conclusion, we believe that UNAMI is a critical partner to the Iraqi people and has played a vital role in helping Iraq during this democratic transition. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me start by joining your words, commending the French presidency during the last month. I also wish Gabon all the best during the month of October, and you know you can count on Brazil. I'd like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General for her briefing, and I would like also to welcome the delegation of Iraq to this meeting. Like the written report submitted by the Secretary General to the Council members a week ago, the presentation made by the Special Representative today recalls us of events we have ourselves been following closely in Iraq, including through our embassy in Baghdad. As protesters have once again taken to the streets to express their frustration with domestic politics in Iraq, Brazil calls upon the Iraqi authorities, the political leaders and parties, and the Iraqi population in general to exercise restraint and not to fuel violence, hatred, or civil unrest. Brazil is also concerned with the attacks in the Iraqi Kurdistan region last week, similarly to other attacks inflicted in Iraq from abroad in the recent past. They are not only contrary to international law, but also they threaten the territorial integrity of the country and the stability of its entire region. In that regard, we acknowledge the importance of calls from within this Council for the protection of civilians under all circumstances. Under the terms of Resolution 2631, we convene to examine the progress in the implementation of UNAMI's mandate. And because of the mandate of UNAMIS, as Chapter 6 as a Chapter 6 mission hinges upon the consent of Iraqi government, it is only fair that we should turn to and ask Iraqi officials for further input. In our view, the most important aspect of UNAMI's mandate is to support Iraqi government on advancing political dialogue and national reconciliation. Success in the implementation of this mandate should be measured by concrete results. Brazil would have hoped that the circumstances in Iraq allowed for swift formation of government based on the outcome of the October 2021 elections. After a year since that outcome, however, the current political impasse took hold. If lessons are not learned, rather than calling for expedited solutions today, we should encourage inclusive and meaningful dialogue between all Iraqi political parties so that they can bridge their differences and make the necessary political agreements beforehand. In that regard, we see value in the organization of the national dialogue proposed by Iraqi Prime Minister, in which we hope all political groups in Iraq can participate. We also noted with satisfaction that the Special Representative attended 2 sessions of the National Dialogue on 17 August and September 5. Brazil, of course, stands ready to lend its support to Iraqi efforts towards peace and security in the country. That's also the primary goal of UNAMI's presence in Iraq, we believe. And, at the same time, we understand it's not upon us to dictate how Iraqi authorities should go about setting or pursuing their national priorities. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I am of course grateful for the briefing made by the Special Representative Ms. Hennis Plasschaert. And of course I welcome the participation at this meeting of the representative of Iraq. The Special Representative shared with the Security Council an analysis of the situation in Iraq, which can be summarized as follows. It is not possible to build democratic institutions and to ensure that a rule of law prevails when the very origin of this situation in Iraq, almost 20 years ago, was another invasion of a sovereign country in the violation of the United Nations Charter. The same can occur in other states whose territorial integrity and independence is being violated, and the recourse to diplomacy continues to be denied. Mexico, of course, joins in the condemnation of the attack that occurred in Iraqi Kurdistan just a few days ago. Unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident. Rather, it confirms a dangerous trend together with the recent attacks in Dohuk and Erbil. Such events are contrary to international law and constitute a violation of the Iraqi sovereignty and territorial integrity, while also representing a serious risk for the stability of the region. As if that weren't enough, over the last 3 months, we have seen more than 180 attacks against Iraqi security forces attributed to the Islamic State in the Levant, as well as bombings of government buildings and premises and diplomatic vehicles, and clashes between law enforcement and protesters. In light of this alarming security situation, I will concentrate now on the political impasse and the need to resume the course of institutional strengthening. This week marks the 3rd anniversary of the start of popular protests following a regime change which led to early elections last year. Almost 1 year after such elections, regrettably, the political factions have been unable to translate popular will into a functional government. We welcome the fact that the participants in the national dialogue convened by the Prime Minister have reiterated their commitment to resolving the political crisis, respecting the constitutional democratic order. We hope that this initiative will lead to the formation of an inclusive government. Despite the high number of women elected as members of the Parliament, we caution, however, that most of them have been excluded from the process to form a government. We underline the importance of guaranteeing the full egalitarian and substantive participation of women, young people, and minorities in this process. Moreover, we urge both the government in Baghdad and the regional government in Erbil to resolve through dialogue the disputes related to the budget and natural resource management, as well as to ensure the thorough implementation of the Sinjar agreements. This process must happen, of course, within the constitutional framework. At a regional level, however, Iraq has been playing a key role in regional stability. In this context, my delegation recognizes the continued progress and bilateral cooperation undertaken by Iraq in resolving the matter of missing Kuwaitis and other country nationals. We also take note of the recent visit of the Special Envoy to the Al-Hol refugee camp in Syria. We recognize the arrangements made by the Iraqi government and the assistance of humanitarian agencies to continue with the repatriation and relocation of around 28,000 Iraqis. Mr. President, with regard to the strengthening of institutional capacities, I stress electoral collaboration between Mexico and Iraq for almost 2 decades. I am pleased to be able to announce in this context that this month, October, a delegation of Iraqi electoral judges is planning to participate in a capacity-building program provided by Mexico's National Electoral Institute and the Electoral Tribunal of the Federal Judiciary. Before closing, I reaffirm once again the importance of very promptly seeing a prosperous, democratic and sovereign Iraq as a cornerstone to the achievement of the peace and stability of the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, allow me to begin by congratulating you on presiding over this council this month. We wish you the utmost success. We are also grateful to France for conducting an efficient presidency last month. I would like to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Iraq, Ms. Janine Hennis-Plasschaert, for her thorough briefing. We further welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of the Republic of Iraq, Ambassador Mohammed Bahr al-Aloom, in today's meeting. Mr. President, today's meeting takes place amidst a critical period for Iraq. The delay in forming a new government over the recent months has led to an escalation of the situation, an increase in violence, and civilian deaths and injuries. The UAE expresses its concern over these events. We call upon all relevant stakeholders to overcome the current obstacles hindering the formation of a new Iraqi government and to ensure that the interests of the Iraqi people prevail over all other considerations. There should be an urgent return to constructive dialogue, calm, and self-restraint. These are critical and indispensable demands. A stable and predictable political institution is necessary to meet the aspirations of the Iraqi people who seek to focus on reconstruction, to live in security and prosperity, and to be ensured access to basic services. We stress here that further violence and escalation will not only impact Iraq and its people, but also the entire region. The UAE also affirms its rejection of foreign interference in the internal affairs of Iraq, which undermines Iraq's sovereignty, unity, territorial integrity, and political independence. We also condemn violence of any kind that continues to destabilize Iraq's security and stability, in contrary to human principles and values. This also includes terrorist acts, especially as Daesh remains a persistent threat in Iraq. The group's relentless attacks reached 184 in number during the reported period of the Secretary General's report. The UAE commends the progress made by the Iraqi forces in combating this scourge, and we look forward to continued efforts until the threat is fully eliminated. There is also a need to continue working to prevent extremism and terrorism and addressing their root causes. There are concerns that the deteriorating security and humanitarian situation in camps such as Al-Hol in Syria provide fertile ground for radicalization and for terrorist groups to exploit the situation to recruit the next generation of terrorists. We welcome Iraq's repatriation with UN assistance of over 2,500 citizens from Al-Hol camp. We emphasize the need to urgently work towards reaching a sustainable solution to the situation in the camp. Mr. President, regarding the missing Kuwaitis and third country nationals, as well as missing Kuwaiti property, including the National Archives, the UAE is encouraged by the incremental progress made during the past 4 months and hopes that such progress will continue. We continue to applaud the efforts by Kuwait and Iraq in this regard. To conclude, the UAE affirms its support for the work of UNAMI in the implementation of its mandate in coordination with the Iraqi government. We welcome the news of Mr. Claudio Cordone assuming his new position as Deputy SRSG for Political Affairs and Electoral Assistance. I would also like to commend the Iraqi people for showing resilience in the face of great adversity. The UAE reaffirms its steadfast support for security and stability in Iraq, as well as reconstruction efforts. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie. Merci le représentant.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин.
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Jeanine Hennis-Plasschaert, for the briefing on the situation in the Republic of Iraq. We are closely following developments in friendly Iraq, where we continue to be troubled by internal political instability, which is compounded by the difficult socioeconomic situation there. Since late July in Baghdad and a number of provinces in the south of the country, there have been large-scale protests which were exacerbated by the seizure of government buildings and attacks targeting political parties' offices. The victims of the heightened clashes included dozens of people. Hundreds were wounded, including law enforcement officials. These events attested to the acute differences among the main political parties in Iraq, who have not been able to conclude the establishment of government bodies following the October 2021 early parliamentary elections. We hope that the parties represented in parliament will soon reach agreement on the candidature of the president and the composition of the new government based on support of all of the main politically united and ethno-religious groups in the country. Mr. President, we are very much troubled by the military escalation in the northern parts of the country, including on the territory of the Kurdish Autonomous Region, which claimed the lives of many civilians and children. We extend our sincere condolences to the families of the dead. Once again, we reiterate that inviolability of civilians needs to remain a priority. We share the view of the President of Iraq, Barham Saleh, that his country should not become an arena for score settling. At the same time, we take note of the statement of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that the recent attack, responsibility for which was assumed by Iran, constitutes a major threat to the country's security from the terrorist groups based in the Kurdish Autonomous Region. According to their recent report of the Secretary General, in various provinces of the Republic, there indeed have been reports of attacks by ISIL fighters, including with the use of suicide bombers, which destabilize the already restive regional security atmosphere. In this context, we wish once again to reiterate that in order to effectively ward off this threat, there is a need for the broadest possible coordination of counterterrorism efforts. We believe there is a need for all stakeholders engaged in counterterrorism in Iraq to respect the sovereignty of the Iraqi state and to coordinate their action with the country's officials. Mr. President, one cannot but note that a sustained normalization in Iraq is obstructed by attempts by certain external players to gain benefits from the internal difficulties. In this context, we urge the international community to support Baghdad's efforts in stabilization of the country, including ensuring law and order as well as restoration of the social, financial, and humanitarian sectors in the Republic. We believe it is unacceptable for this country to morph into an arena for personal score settling and regional confrontation. The Russian Federation supports the efforts of the Iraqi government geared towards remedying the situation. We trust that all Iraqi stakeholders will demonstrate and responsible approach will eschew violence and will strive to resolve their differences through the legal framework, exclusively accounting for the interests of all country groups. We value the resumed dialogue between the federal authorities of Baghdad and the Kurdish Autonomous Region on resolving existing differences, first and foremost in oil and gas sphere. We believe that a further resolution will help to advance a resolution to the ethno-religious issues that have amassed and will help to harness the economic potential for the benefit of the entire Iraqi people. To conclude, we wish to reaffirm our commitment to the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and stability of Iraq.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to congratulate Gabon on assuming the presidency of the Council for this month, and I thank France for its work as a president for last month. China thanks SRSG Hennis Plasschaert for her briefing and welcomes the permanent representative of Iraq at today's meeting. I congratulate Iraq because today is the National Day of Iraq. At present, Iraq is at a crucial political phase, facing such major tasks as forming the new government. We sincerely hope that all parties in Iraq will strengthen unity, properly settle their differences, and within the constitutional and legal framework, conduct dialogue and consultations to seek consensus on next steps of political arrangements, with a view to laying a solid political foundation for lasting peace, development, and prosperity. All members of the international community should fully respect the sovereignty and ownership of Iraq and support the Iraqi people in independently choosing a development path that fits their national conditions. With its strategic location, as well as ethnic and religious diversity, Iraq should become a propeller of regional cooperation, not a game field for geopolitical competition. China commends Iraq for developing good neighborly and friendly relations with countries in the region and promoting regional integration. We support Iraq in its joint efforts with Kuwait in achieving progress in the search for missing Kuwaiti nationals and property. China has always stood for full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, Iraq included, and has always stood for common security through cooperation. Iraq has made huge sacrifices in combating ISIL and recovering the territories originally occupied by terrorists and extremist organizations. The international community must continue its firm support to Iraq in eradicating the remnants of terror and consolidating the hard-won counterterrorism results. UNITAD must hand over as soon as possible the evidence it has collected to Iraq and help Iraq bring terrorists to justice in accordance with domestic law. China welcomes Iraq's continuous efforts in repatriating and resettling Iraqi citizens from Al-Hol camp in Syria. We urge other countries to take up their responsibilities as Iraq has done and speed up the identification and repatriation of FTFs and their families from Iraq. Over the past 3 decades or so, Iraq has experienced ups and downs in its situation, which has brought huge sufferings to its people. Under the current circumstances, the international community should continue its firm support to Iraq in safeguarding its security and stability and actively help the country rebuild this country with the focus on improving people's livelihood. UNAMI and other UN agencies must channel more resources and attention to supporting Iraq's national development priorities. UNAMI, in its human rights-related and humanitarian work, must strictly follow the mandate, closely communicate and coordinate with the Iraqi government, and improve screening and verification of information. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I thank SRSG Hennis Plasschaert for your clear and important briefing and for all your efforts and the efforts of your team during very challenging times. Almost a year has gone by since Iraq conducted parliamentary elections, yet still no government has been formed. Norway joins the Secretary General and others in expressing concern over this absence and the risks it may pose for Iraq's political stability. The formation of a government is vital to address the many challenges Iraq is facing. It is time for Iraqi political leaders to unite. It is time to find compromises. Iraq must have a government which can work in the best interest of the Iraqi people. And we encourage all political leaders to ensure the meaningful participation of women, youth, and civil society. President, Norway is deeply concerned by the increase in political tensions and violence. We call for calm and restraint. All parties must take steps to de-escalate and violence must be avoided. As this Council has stated on several occasions, the unity, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iraq must be respected. President, 2022 is the last year of the humanitarian response plan. We commend the Iraqi authorities for taking over responsibility for fulfilling humanitarian needs. The children are especially vulnerable. In the current efforts to reintegrate displaced families in their home communities, special care should be made to protect the children and treat them as victims of war. This includes children formerly associated with ISIS. Norway will continue our humanitarian assistance and cooperation with Iraqi authorities. Finally, Mr. President, the challenges Iraq is facing are also exacerbated by climate change and severe environmental problems. Norway commends the joint efforts of UNAMI and the Iraqi authorities on climate action, improving regional cooperation on water management and investing in a renewable future. For this work to succeed, it must include working with private partners and civil society. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of France. I thank you, Mr. President. And I, in turn, would like to thank the Special Representative for her briefing. I, too, would like to welcome with us the Permanent Representative of Iraq today. Mr. President, France firmly condemns the massive airstrikes claimed by Iran in the region of Kurdistan, which have affected civilians. This is a violation of international law and a threat to peace and security. France recalls its commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iraq and the respect of the autonomous region of Kurdistan. We call on the concerned actors to stop any interference in the internal affairs of Iraq. 1 year after the legislative elections, the political situation continues as an impasse. We call on the political actors to shoulder their responsibilities and to come to an agreement on the formation of a government. We also invite them to reaffirm their commitment to the Iraqi constitutional framework to restrict the integrity of Iraqi institutions. We welcome the initiatives that have been taken by the Prime Minister to relaunch the national dialogue, which is the only possible way out of the current impasse. It's essential that this dialogue be inclusive and enable the participation of women that to date have been excluded from the talks, even though they were elected in November to the Parliament, as has been repeated here. Mr. President, every day without a government after the last elections increases the risk of the destabilization of Iraq. The formation of a government is a crucial step to avoid a new deterioration of the situation. France calls also on the authorities in Iraq and Erbil to resume dialogue. The cooperation between the federal authorities and the regional autonomous government in Kurdistan is particularly important, particularly on oil resources and other matters. President, despite the challenges that Iraq is facing, Iraq continues in its courageous battle against Daesh, and we reiterate our firm commitment to Iraq in fighting terrorism. We will continue our commitment in this area in the context of our contribution to the international coalition against Daesh, with full respect for the sovereignty of Iraq, while this is necessary and as long as this is requested by Iraq, Iraq also continues to play a positive role at the regional level. We welcome the efforts in this area of the Prime Minister, and we welcome all initiatives for regional dialogue contributing to the stability of the region and to meeting comprehensive challenges. We look forward to the Amman summit. We welcome the Amman summit, which laid the foundations for a credible dialogue, which is urgently needed by the region. Finally, I welcome the cooperation between Kuwait and Iraq on the missing Kuwaiti and third country nationals. We believe that satellite imagery and witness statements are particularly important to continue the dialogue in this area. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I thank the representative of France for her statement. I will now make a statement on behalf of the A3, Kenya, Ghana, and my country, Gabon.
I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3, Ghana, Kenya, and my country, Gabon. We thank SRG Janine Ennis Plasschaert for her informative briefing, which we have followed closely on recent development in Iraq and activities on the United Nations Assistance Mission in Iraq. We also welcome the participation of the distinguished representative of Iraq at this session. We will focus our intervention on three main issues relating to the situation in Iraq: political, security, and humanitarian aspect. On the political front, Iraqis are still waiting for the formation of government long after the parliamentary election that were held on October 10, 2021. The persistent lack of unity among political actors and the lack of inclusion, particularly of women, despite the remarkable result they obtained in the election, are obstacles to the implementation of reforms essential to the suitable functioning of the country. The rapid formation of a new government is more crucial now. It will be a critical first step towards promoting long-term political stability in Iraq. As evidenced by recent protests in Iraq, further delays is forming a government will only have a destabilizing impact on that country. We see an urgent need for a new Iraqi government that will also be able to address the multiple challenges facing the country. A new Iraqi government will be vital for the implementation of reforms essential to the proper functioning of the country and responding to legitimate aspiration of the Iraqi people for peace, security, stability, socio-economic progress through the provision of basic services, and to contain the adverse effects of climate change characterized by extreme weather conditions. It is in this spirit that the A3 call on the various political actors to take concerted steps to diffuse tensions and to engage in a genuine and inclusive political dialogue based on the peaceful, democratic, and constitutional principle and means in the spirit of political compromise. Reaching the decision of the selection and election of a president will, in this regard, be a positive first step. We also strongly encourage the inclusion and involvement of women in the request for political initiative and the efforts towards government formation to resolve the impasse. The A3 commends UNAMI's continued support to the post-election activities in Iraq and calls on the Independent High Electoral Commission and the Independent High Commission for Election and Referendums of the Kurdistan region to strengthen their cooperation and pool their technical expertise. We take note of the efforts of the government of Iraq to foster dialogue and cooperation within the region. We therefore encourage Iraq's regional and international partners to support these efforts while respecting the principle of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and good neighborly relation for the benefit of the country and the region. We further welcome the ongoing cooperation between Iraq and Kuwait and encourage more progress in this important file. On the security front, the situation in Iraq remains volatile and worrying, including in the Kurdistan region. Asymmetrical attacks by Daesh and unidentified armed groups targeting Iraqi security forces, drone overflights, and the use of explosive devices and ballistic missiles are recurrent. This escalation of violence is likely to hamper hard-won peace and stability effort on Iraqi territory. We therefore call for urgent de-escalation and discourage any action that will impede government formation. The A3 condemns military operation by external actors in the north and reaffirmed that Iraq must not be used as an international arena for state and non-state actors to settle scores at the expense and detriment of the security, political stability, and socio-economic progress of the country and its people. In the meantime, we are deeply concerned by the recent attacks occurred in September 28, which killed many people and injured civilians, including children. On the humanitarian front, significant needs remain. Civilians are paying the heaviest price for the instability in Iraq. According to UNAMI, of the 87 facts established during the period under review, there are 201 civilian casualties, including women and children, mainly affected by small arms, fire, improvised explosive devices, shelling, and remnants of war devices. Violation of children's rights are of the utmost concern to us. There are 63 documented cases of grave violations against children, including killing, maiming, abduction, sexual violence, and recruitment. We take note of the observation by the Committee Against Torture on Iraq's second periodic report on measures taken to ensure compliance with the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, as well as the recommendation made, including the adoption of legislation against torture. In the same vein, we note that the impact of the Iraqi government's human rights efforts, including compensation for victims, is relatively limited due to the persistence of impunity for perpetrators of violations. To that end, we commend the prevention and capacity building work of the Iraqi authorities by UNAMI. The A3 welcomes the assistance that the United Nations, in collaboration with the government of Iraq, continue to provide to internally displaced persons, returnees, and refugees, despite the drastic decline in humanitarian funding. We share the congratulations extended to the government of Iraq by the Special Representative for the repatriation of more than 2,500 Iraqis in accordance with the principle of accountability and reintegration. We also welcome the continued commitment of the United Nations to provide humanitarian and protection assistance to them after their return. In conclusion, we reiterate the full support of the A3 for UNAMI's effort in the implementation of Resolution 2631 and for Special Representative Jeanine Hennis-Plasschaert for her commitment on implementing the United Nations mandate under the resolution. I thank you. Je reprends mes fonctions de...
I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Iraq.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to congratulate you for presiding over the Council for this month representing Gabon. I also thank His Excellency Ambassador Nicolas de Rivière, Permanent Representative of France, for the efforts made during his presidency of the Council in September. I also thank Her Excellency Ms. Janine Placher, the Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of UNAMI, for her briefing. Mr. President, the political process has been facing deadlock, delaying the formation of a new Iraqi government following the parliamentary elections of October 2021. All stakeholders and Iraqi political blocs are aware of the current situation. Therefore, they have all engaged in a constructive and serious dialogue and in an honest dialogue in order to reach an agreement and to find solutions to the current political stalemate. The holding of a parliamentary session last week, after 2 months, and renewing the confidence in the Speaker and choosing the first Vice Speaker is another step in the right direction, allowing the Parliament to play its supervisory and legislative roles and allowing the parliamentary committees to undertake their daily activities. This is an important step towards a political breakthrough in light of the constitutional deadlines. This would eventually lead to electing a president of the Republic and to forming a new government that would answer the basic needs of the Iraqi people and guarantee political security and economic stability for Iraq and the region. We are celebrating the third anniversary of the Tishreen demonstrations in 2019. Those were peaceful demonstrations led by young Iraqi men and women asking for reforms and fighting corruption. We would like to present our condolences to the families of the martyrs, and we wish the wounded a swift recovery. We also commend the efforts of the Iraqi security forces, which have been showing the highest levels of responsibility and restraint, and they have been providing peaceful protection to these demonstrations, which have celebrated 3 days ago the third Tishreen movement. The security forces have avoided confrontation with some disruptive elements that have attempted to attack them. The government of Iraq is keen on making Iraq a source of stability in its regional and international environment and to contributing to finding sustainable peaceful solutions to the regional crises and differences between the countries of the region, avoiding to negatively impact the security and stability of Iraq. The government of Iraq, through its balanced relationships and through the Iraqi diplomacy, have been supporting several initiatives and meetings between the countries of the region. Those were among the important outcomes of the Baghdad Conference for Partnership and Cooperation. Consultations are currently being held to convene the third session of the Baghdad Conference for Partnership and Cooperation. President, allow me to briefly submit the most important developments in Iraq in the past 4 months. First, on the security level, Iraq would like to thank the Security Council for his support and for enhancing our capabilities in combating terrorism. We are thankful for the field visit made by CETED in July 2022 on behalf of the Security Council Committee established under Resolution 1373 of 2001. Iraq is committed to cooperating with the International Alliance to defeat Daesh. we are also committed to multilateral cooperation through the United Nations and with the specialized UN agencies. We look forward to welcoming the Under-Secretary General for Preventing Terrorism, Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, in the near future. Iraq reiterates the concerns mentioned in the Secretary General's report, especially with regards to the fact that tens of thousands of foreign terrorist fighters and their families are still in the detention camps in Syria. We call upon the United Nations to enhance their field presence through the UNOCT. Iraq reiterates the need for the member states to repatriate their nationals from El-Hol and other camps, and for the responsible authorities to extradite the Iraqi terrorist fighters to Iraq. Iraq also emphasizes that it is ready to complete the repatriation efforts to repatriate its nationals from these camps, and we hope that the international community will support us in rehabilitation and reintegration. Iraq reiterates its call not to use Iraq as a scene to settle scores or to achieve political goals under the pretext of fighting terrorism. We call upon the Security Council and the member states to seriously consider this issue. Regarding the Turkish and Iranian breaches, the Turkish and Iranian violations of the territorial integrity of Iraq are still ongoing under vain pretexts following the Turkish bombing targeting safe Iraqi families in the Doq province in July. Iran has attacked by air and with missiles and drones cities and villages in the Kurdistan region last week, targeting several Iraqi cities, especially the morning of the 28th of September. This had led to the killing and wounding of several Iraqi civilians, including women and children. It has terrorized the population, destroyed the infrastructure. The Foreign Ministry have submitted a very strong letter to the ambassador of Iran in Baghdad, in which we have condemned this crime, and we reiterated our rejection of such acts and of their consequences, and we have demanded them to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iraq and called upon Iran to live up to its international commitments and give up the language of weapons and of violence to settle the regional challenges, and we have warned of the spillovers of such acts on the security and stability in both countries and in the region. In this context, we call upon the Security Council to reiterate its position towards the Iraqi dossier and to reiterate the sovereignty of Iraq and its territorial integrity by condemning any foreign attack on our land and on our sovereignty by any party, and prevent turning Iraq into a scene to settle scores. Supporting the liberated regions, Iraq is looking forward to further UN support in order to rebuild the liberated and damaged regions. These regions were destroyed by Daesh and other armed groups. We look forward to receiving further UN assistance to answer the basic humanitarian urgent needs to build the Iraqi capabilities. We hope that you will be supporting the Iraqi program for reconstructing the liberated areas and for rebuilding the destroyed infrastructure. Regarding the government's program, the government of Iraq reiterates its commitment to the education and higher education strategy for 2030, including increasing the schooling rates to 100% and improving the quality of education and higher education while enhancing the skills in line with the labor market and the requirements of economic development. In terms of women empowerment, we have restored the Ministry of Women Affairs, providing it with a clear ministerial portfolio and mandate to promote and protect women's rights and advance gender equality. The Women Empowerment Department is implementing the second Iraqi National Plan 1325 of 2000 to enhance the participation of women in leadership and decision-making and to promote peace and security. The General Directorate for the Yazidi survivors is collecting evidence and information in order to implement the necessary reparations in line with the law. They were allocated part of the food security budget in June. The political stakeholders are also keen on guaranteeing the participation of Iraqi women in the political life and in the current dialogue to form the new government, allowing them to occupy senior and leadership positions in our national institutions. The Iraqi High Commission for Human Rights is also pursuing its efforts and following up on the humanitarian and relief situation and on the health situation. It is also following up on the healthcare provided to the families of the refugees in Anbar Governorate. The Archaeology, Heritage and Tourism Authority is also working on the rehabilitation of archaeological sites and buildings in the Ninawa Plains and the other governorates. The High Commission is also monitoring human rights violations and documenting them. It is also launching awareness campaigns concerning the International Convention on Domestic Violence. The Iraqi government and the national institutions and law enforcement agencies are also prosecuting all violations and individual behaviors in line with Iraq's international commitments to enhance and protect human rights. With regard to combating desertification and climate change, Iraq is the fifth most vulnerable country towards climate change. It is suffering water scarcity and changes in the water courses with the neighboring countries. We have also been negatively affected by projects that were implemented without taking into account their impacts on the water shares between co-riparians. This led to increasing desertification and drought in the natural protected areas, especially in Al-Ahwar region. It also led to reducing the arable lands and to an increase in internal displacement. Therefore, Iraq calls upon all the countries of the region to engage in a dialogue to solve our water differences in line with international laws and agreements. Iraq is an oil-producing country. It has contributed to the global economic recovery since the beginning of the 20th century. And if Iraq is suffering
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.